Guilty as charged. Good afternoon. I have a variety of announcements today. First, yesterday the Department of Defense began moving military aircraft and vessels at East Coast locations to protect them from potential Hurricane Floyd damage. 13 Navy vessels from Mayport, Florida have left port for the open seas, and more than 400 aircraft from bases in Florida, Georgia, and North and South Carolina are flying to inland locations in Georgia, Texas, Kentucky, and Ohio. About 7,000 Marine Corps recruits and drill instructors are evacuating the Marine Corps Recruit Depot at Parris Island, South Carolina, and moving to the Marine Corps Logistics Base in Albany, Georgia. More than 4,000 National Guard soldiers and airmen in Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina have been ordered to state active duty to assist law enforcement and local officials with evacuation, general site security, and logistics. The Army is preparing for a humanitarian response in support of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, should that be necessary as the storm moves along the East Coast. The Army Corps of Engineers has 3 teams en route to the southeastern United States, and the teams are designed to provide emergency ice, water, and debris clearance, respectively. Fort Gillem, Georgia, has been designated as a mobilization site for additional reserve assets. Now, there is a great deal of additional detail, specific units that are moving, but rather than read those from the podium today, I would just ask that you get that from the news desk, but that we can break down those numbers further if you need additional details.
Many other aircraft that are moving in the next 24 to 48 hours.
There are some, not many, I don't think, John, no. And it really does depend also on the storm's track. You'll notice that a lot of the preparations that I've mentioned, some do include North Carolina, but most stop at the North-South Carolina border, and we'll just see where that storm track takes us. Second, tomorrow afternoon, Secretary of Defense Cohen will present the Jospeph J. Krusel Award for Distinguished Service in the Pursuit of Peace. The award will go to Mr. Jeremy Rosner, former Special Advisor to the President and Secretary of State for NATO enlargement ratification. Following the award presentation, Secretary Cohen will make a few remarks to preview next week's NATO Defense Ministers meeting in Toronto, Canada. And following these remarks, Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Frank Kramer, will make himself available to the media for a discussion of the NATO Ministerial, the Defense Capabilities Initiative, and other topics of interest. And details are available again in a press advisory that we'll put out this afternoon. I don't have the time on that. Well, 3 o'clock tomorrow. Next, Secretary Cohen will make remarks and join the Air Force leadership in awarding Silver Star medals to 3 Air Force pilots from Operation Allied Force tomorrow at 4 o'clock at Andrews Air Force Base. And again, we'll put out more details in a press advisory on that this afternoon. This Friday, Secretary Cohen, General Shelton, and Senator Max Cleland will speak at a National POW MIA Recognition Day ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. Ceremony begins at 11 a.m. POW MIA Recognition Day is traditionally held on the 3rd Friday in September. On that day, commemorations are held at many sites throughout the country. The commemoration at Arlington will include formal military honors with assembled troops from all of the military services and 2 joint service flyovers, one with helicopters and one with jet aircraft. As we announced on June 17th, part of the ceremony Friday will include the formal dedication of a new inscription above the existing dates, and those are 1958 to 1975, on the tomb cover of the Vietnam Unknown in the Tomb of the Unknowns. That inscription reads, "Honoring and keeping faith with America's missing servicemen." The event is open to the public, of course, and if should you wish to attend, please contact Patty Hurd over at the Military District of Washington Public Affairs Office. Next, the U.S. Commission on National Security in the 21st Century will release its first report tomorrow at 2 p.m. at the National Press Club. The commission, formerly known as the National Security Study Group, is co-chaired by former Senators Gary Hart and Warren Rudman. Both co-chairmen and commissioners will be available at the Press Club to discuss the commission's report. For further information on that, please contact Mr. Hank Sharpenberg of the commission at 703-602-4175. Next, Egyptian military forces and members of the U.S. Central Command's Army, Air Force, Navy, Marine, and Special Operations components will participate in a joint combined coalition computer-aided command post exercise and tactical field training exercise with military forces from 9 other coalition nations in Egypt. This exercise is called Bright Star and will take place October 10th through November 2nd and will involve approximately 18,000 U.S. military personnel. We'll have further details on that later on this afternoon as well. And last, Secretary Cohen announced today that the President has nominated Army Lieutenant General John W. Hendrix for appointment to the grade of General and assignment as Commanding General, U.S. Army Forces Command at Fort McPherson, Georgia. General Hendrix is currently serving as the Commanding General of 5th Corps, United States Army Europe, and 7th Army in Heidelberg, Germany. Now, along with General Hendrix's nomination, there are several additional, I think 4 or 5, flag officer announcements on the table, and I invite you to pick those copies up before you leave. We broke General Hendrix out because this is the only 4-star appointment that we're announcing this afternoon, but there are several other 2- and 3-star officers on the table on your way out. So, with those announcements, I will take your questions.
Greg, in regards to East Timor, have we begun to identify any units or specific assets for use in supporting a peacekeeping humanitarian operation?
We're taking this one step at a time, and the next step that must happen, hopefully this afternoon, as soon as possible, is a complete description from the UN Security Council to come up with a mandate. What is the mission of an international peacekeeping force? When you have that definition in hand, each of the nations, the United States among them, can then have go to the next step in planning to determine what forces are needed to carry out that mandate, whatever that might be. We have committed to being a part of this and active participation in the overall process, but we need that mandate as the next step in the process before specific planning can take place as to what U.S. forces will be involved. As we've said before on several occasions, it's pretty clear the areas that will be involved in participation in the intelligence, communications, logistics, and strategic lift. And I would add food support as well. As President Clinton said yesterday and today, I believe, we have humanitarian rations, humanitarian daily rations. 300,000 of them are being palletized for shipment to Darwin. And from there, these are at the Tracy Defense Depot in California right now. And they'll be airlifted to Darwin, turned over to the UN for distribution. We're not sure what's the most efficient way of distributing those humanitarian daily rations, but we'll work closely with the UN on that as well.
Is there any kind of a tentative schedule on getting these rations to Darwin?
Well, we anticipate the palletization to be done very soon. I can't give you an exact time frame, but that activity is ongoing right now.
Do you anticipate any particular problems flying in and out of greater metropolitan Dili? I mean,
well,
is the runway very short? Do they have aids to navigation, the kind of things you usually need?
We're working, again, kind of a 2-step process there, continuing to talk very closely with the Indonesian government, Indonesian military, Australians, and also part of the UN Security Council discussions going on today for specific access agreements and which airports would be available, and then getting from the Indonesians the specific capabilities of the various airports. Undoubtedly, some will be restricted to certain smaller types of aircraft. Some will hopefully be able to accommodate larger aircraft. We're very confident that the Tyndall which is the military airfield outside Darwin, can accommodate any of the large strategic airlift aircraft. But we've yet to complete the assessment and discussions with the Indonesians on the capabilities and limitations of the various airfields within Timor.
If you have a UN resolution today, for example, how rapidly do you think the international community can move to have boots on the ground with a peacekeeping force? Days, weeks, months?
We want to see this happen just as soon as possible, and we would be hopeful that a force could be inserted into East Timor within days.
U.S. troops be part of peacekeeping or police forces there?
We will certainly be participants in the overall effort, although in the traditional sense of providing what you would think of, Bill, in the sense of like infantry or rifle companies in large numbers as peacekeepers on the ground, that has not been a part of our consideration so far. It's been the 4 areas that I mentioned before, and now the humanitarian to help in some way, shape, or form in the delivery of the humanitarian daily rations as well.
Just to clarify that, you're saying you don't envision having infantry troops, U.S., take part in some kind of thing? They're going to be in those 4 areas? They're going to be limited to those 4 areas?
Well, I need to be specific here, too, because there will be U.S. uniformed personnel on the ground in East Timor. But they'll be operating communications equipment. They'll be providing that intelligence support. They'll be undoubtedly assisting at whichever airports we end up with, if it's airlift, in coordinating the resupply, the maintenance, and what have you of any aircraft that would be used. But again, in large numbers of rifle companies and infantry companies that you think of when you think of large numbers of peacekeeping forces, that is not under consideration.
Do you have a general number for how many U.S. would be involved?
Again, in the hundreds, although that just doesn't have much more clarity to it than that. But that's in the ballpark, I think. John?
Are we going
Your 2 questions, Greg. Your qualifier that there won't be infantry or rifle companies in large numbers seems to me to leave open the possibility that there may be some there for sort of perimeter security duties around the other U.S. troops. Is that an accurate deduction?
Well, we are always concerned with force protection, certainly. And again, these were part of discussions ongoing within the UN context and with the Indonesian government and military as to who will provide what. But one way or another, the U.S. forces that do find themselves on the ground in East Timor will be well protected as good as we can do it.
And a separate issue. There are reports that there's already a team of, I think 9 is the figure I've seen, U.S. troops, U.S. military personnel of some kind that are working with the Australians already in Australia.
15, actually.
Can you elaborate on what they're doing?
Yes, these are planners from the Admiral Blair's staff in Hawaii, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Command. We're on the ground in Darwin as of last Friday. I don't know what time of day, but as of last Friday, to assist the Australian Defence Force in their planning efforts. And our intentions are to keep that force there and assist in that effort indefinitely.
My question is basically the same. I mean, are we going to rely on other countries or the UN for force protection for our own people that are on the ground?
We are going to be able to provide very clear, unambiguous force protection for U.S. troops and U.S. facilities that are on the ground in East Timor. Now, the specifics of how we're accomplishing that, we're not there yet. But there will be no question that those forces will have a solid, rock-solid force protection package in place.
When
Bill.
you're talking about, go ahead, Bill. What's the role of airlift? Are we going to be sending planes out to various countries to gather up their troops and equipment and fly them into East Timor or to Australia?
I would envision that we would be doing some of that because that's one of the things that is a great strength of the United States military that many other nations don't have in the numbers that are required to move large numbers of troops and equipment and material from one place to another. But we do anticipate that the makeup of the peacekeeping force will be largely Asian, so you're not talking about huge distances here, so that's an advantage. But it's still, that's a big part of the world. And it'll all depend on which nations eventually agree to provide what forces and perhaps some airlift as well. But that is one of the things we fully expect to be very engaged in, yes.
Do you envision this going on? How many planes and what, I mean, like C-17, C-5s?
The aircraft at the nation's disposal, okay, at the U.S. Transportation Command's disposal, are all fair game for selection. It would depend on what do you need to move, over what distance, from where to where, and what are the airport capabilities and limitations that you're going to be flying into and out of. So that chapter of the book has not yet been written.
Length of time you're talking about?
I don't have a good answer for that one. Yes, sir.
U.S. is saying that Indonesia must agree to the international force, and also at the same time, until yesterday, Indonesians are saying that they don't want U.S., Australians, and New Zealand forces. So where do we...
Well, I think the Australian Foreign Minister yesterday listed that as a concern, although not a precondition. And Secretary General Annan assured him that the UN would continue to work very closely with the Indonesian military and government to assuage any concerns that they may have. But it was a concern, not a condition. Yes, sir.
You're talking about several hundred U.S. personnel assigned to this operation. Is that assigned to the operation or actually on the island of East Timor when you're talking about several?
On the island of East Timor, you could, if you count aircraft, air crews, if there are ships involved and those ships' crews, we would not count that as a part of the overall numbers of people that would be part of a peacekeeping force, although you certainly should count them as contributing to the overall effort. But as far as the numbers of people that would be operating these intelligence units, communications units, and things of that sort, you're talking about in the hundreds.
Would it be fair to say several thousand people would be contributing to this?
I hesitate to give you a range on that because we've just not gone to that specific level of planning.
Who's going to pay for all these expenses and cost involved in the international?
Well, a variety of sources. The humanitarian daily rations, for instance, the USAID will pay for that. There'll be some paid monies coming from UN High Commission on Refugees, I would anticipate. Some would be borne by the Defense Department, U.S. Defense Department, some by state, a variety of other agencies of the federal government. So it would be several different sources of the funding for the U.S. support overall. John?
Ground with your, I'm sorry.
That's right.
Are you going to hit the ground with the humanitarian palletized stuff at approximately the same time you do with peacekeepers? Is that your plan? Or to wait until peacekeepers are all ensconced?
We're looking at it as two separate things. If they occurred at the same time, we're looking at it as a positive. But that's not necessarily a precondition, John. We're going to move on right now with the provision of the humanitarian daily rations. And like I said, we hope, regardless of peacekeepers, that's right. And we would look to the UN to help with the distribution system within East Timor. Now, as the days go by and we have a peacekeeping force within East Timor, and as they start to spread out throughout the area, if we take another look at it at that point and find out that there's a better, more efficient way of distribution, we'll certainly adapt. But we're looking at it as two separate events at this point, and if they can combine, and that would be a better way to manage this effort, so be it.
Isn't there some kind of a disconnect here? I mean, you're going to have, if it doesn't necessarily dovetail with the arrival of the peacekeepers, then you rely on the UN personnel in East Timor to hand out the supplies. Yet most UN personnel in East Timor have left.
Oh, very true, very true.
In East Timor, so
yeah, 12 or 13. I'm getting.
Arrive before your troops seems.
We want to
insane.
get the foodstuffs, the 300,000 rations, to Darwin, and then put this in the hands of the UN distribution authorities. Now, how they feel they can best get that food then into East Timor, that we would defer to their expertise in this area. Now, in the days ahead, when the peacekeeping force goes in, and you have peacekeepers on the ground and a larger UN presence, probably a presence of private, non-governmental organizations as well, perhaps that would be a distribution system that might work out. We haven't worked out that detail, but certainly we wouldn't ask for the 12 or the 13 UN personnel still on the ground in East Timor to do that now.
Is any thought been given to airdropping this stuff in extremis as a first
We're
step?
looking for the most efficient way to do this, John. We don't think that airdropping is a very efficient way to do it. But if it's the only way, we'll consider it. But it's not a very efficient way to do this.
Still on those rations, given the staggering numbers that were used in Kosovo, in the refugee camps, can you give us any sense, I don't expect you to have it now, but can you give us some sense later on what stocks we have of these rations and whether we have to crank up some more?
Yes. I know these are all coming from that depot in California, but I can, a very large number, I don't have that with me now. We'll get that for you later. Bill?
You mentioned the intelligence end of this a couple of times. What is that? Is that troops on the ground, spy planes, satellites?
Well, the ability to provide intelligence products and intelligence information is a potpourri. It's people, it's equipment, it's communications capabilities, it's reconnaissance assets, it's all of the above, taken together as a whole to give you as complete a picture as you can.
For this operation, is it people on the ground or planes flying over?
Well, since we've not chosen the units that would go into to support this piece of our participation in the force, I can't give you a good answer. But I mean, in general, you get intelligence support in those areas that I just described. Ultimately, you're going to get to the point where you are choosing a specific unit, and that unit has a certain number of people, certain number of pieces of equipment, and what have you.
New subject?
Yes.
Another subject?
Can we stay on any other East Timor questions?
One other question.
Jim?
Nancy Pelosi and Barney Frank were on the House floor today, and they're very critical of the military-to-military contacts, the IMET that Jay said, all of the activities that have gone on. They're saying if the point of these contacts is to get a military that respects human rights more, it seems to be a complete and utter failure. That's a paraphrase of their words, but that's the essence of it. I suspect you have a different take on the matter.
We have a variety of ways to engage between the United States military and the militaries of other nations. The whole purpose is engagement. You are either involved in a dialogue with the militaries of other nations or you're not. And no one expects that every effort will be 100% successful, but the alternative is having zero voice, zero chance of success in any sort of a negotiation or a discussion with a U.S. military person's counterpart in another nation. Human beings react well to faces that they have seen before, people with whom they have had a conversation before. And the old cliche about an emergency or a crisis is not the best time to place that first phone call to a person with whom you've never had any relationship is absolutely true. So the whole purpose of IMET, Indonesia, is not a good example of a robust IMET program. We have had a very limited IMET program with the military of Indonesia. In numbers of students, I think it's, if you compare it with other nations like the Philippines and Thailand, we've got 10 times as many students engaged in IMET programs with those nations as we do with Indonesia. So I don't look to Indonesia as this very limited program of IMET to be an example of how a robust program ought to work, because this one's been very limited. But the engagement on a military-to-military basis at all levels, from students in military colleges to diesel engine repair training to the highest level individuals. King Abdullah of Jordan attended the U.S. Army's armor school in 1985 as a captain, and now he is the head of that nation's government. The foreign ministers, prime ministers, defense ministers of many nations around the world attended some number of either IMET or expanded IMET programs during their years as they matured and developed professionally. So there are many, many examples of positive results from an engagement program, military to military, and IMET is just one of them.
In light of the military's actions in East Timor, when they failed to stop the militias, or in some cases apparently assisted in their outrageous actions, are the taxpayers getting the influence and access that are obviously the goal of this program?
I think the taxpayers are getting a tremendous return on their investment through this program. This is not an expensive program. $50 million, I believe, was the dollar figure in 1998. Don't have 99s completed yet. And that trains literally hundreds of people, very junior to very senior, at a variety of training opportunities both here and abroad. And I think it's a tremendous value. And there are lots of examples of strong successes in this area around the world with many nations.
What is the earliest that you expect U.S. personnel to be on the ground in East Timor?
I would hope that we could have a force on the ground within days. Can't be much more precise than that because I'm just not sure, but within days.
The last thing on the 300,000 rations, are you anticipating those will begin flying from the United States in the next 24 hours, next 48 hours?
Yes, John, as soon as we get them palletized.
So you'll put them in the air sometime in the next day or two?
Yes. Mm-hmm. John, Barry?
Press coverage. Have you given any thought yet to covering either the American airlift operations of Eqyptian or the wider operation within East Timor, which presumably comes out of the UN, but I'm sure the US will have some significant say in how that's handled.
We're starting to do that now, yes. Working again with the Australians and ultimately the Indonesians. Mm-hmm.
Yes. I wanted to switch subjects here.
Okay. Any other questions on East Timor? If I could, just one sec.
It was reported by the State Department that there is now a risk of refugees in West Timor being harassed by the same kind of militia gangs. I understand that is another theater of potential trouble. Can you comment?
Well, that's certainly a concern, Bill. I've seen the reports that you refer to. We do not have very good visibility or knowledge of particulars on the ground, both in West and East Timor. So that's yet another reason for as quickly as we can to get an international force in there to provide visibility as well as the assistance. So we're not sure, we're not able to assess well the accuracy of reports that are coming out on either East or West Timor. All the better reason to get in there sooner rather than later.
Yeah, a former KGB officer, Vasily Mitrokhin, has said most recently Sunday and in his book that the KGB smuggled explosives into the United States for sabotage purposes against infrastructure. Is the Pentagon aware of this? Have they tried to find the locations of these explosives? What can you say about that?
Well, the book you're referring to, I think, is due to be published next week, Bill, if I remember correctly. I've seen a couple reviews on it, but I haven't seen it on any shelves. But your point is, and I think there's an example cited in the book of specific directions to an arms cache in Switzerland that was provided in there. The author is much less specific when he refers to any such efforts in the United States, and I think he caveats by saying could and might and may, so there's not a lot to go on there. If he has any more specifics, we'd love to hear them.
Well, presumably the U.S. intelligence community, the Pentagon, would have access to his information since he defected in '92. Is this the first that you had heard about anything? You haven't done any kind of interest in actually going after some of these caches?
No, not that I'm aware of, Bill, no.
Have you approached the Russians on this about whether or not they've done this?
No, we have not. Not since the reports came out in the last couple days on the book. And again, he's very much less specific on any sort of similar caches in the United States. And we would welcome any additional information he could provide, but it need to be a little bit more specific, I think. Yes.
It was reported that the Great Minister of Defense, Apostle Jospeph, is coming to the United States at the invitation of Secretary Cohen. Do you know what prompted the Secretary to invite Jospeph at this time? And may we have something for the agenda?
Secretary Cohen makes it a point to maintain the closest possible relationship with his counterparts, ministers of defense in all of the NATO nations particularly, but as well many other nations around the world. So the Greek Minister of Defense, as one of his counterparts, part of an ongoing program of discussions where Secretary Cohen would go to Greece and the Greek Minister of Defense would come here. You see that with each of the nations of NATO particularly. Now, as far as the particulars of their conversation, I don't have that today. I'll see what I could get you, but I don't have it here.
On the Bright Start exercise of October 10th, you mentioned earlier in Egypt. Could you please identify the 9 nations participating?
I think I do have that. Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, France, Italy, Germany, Greece, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom.
Who initiated this exercise?
I'm sorry?
Who initiated this exercise?
This is a long-standing annual exercise. It's been going on for many years. I don't know the year of its origin. We can get that for you. But it's a long-standing exercise, been in place many years. Yes, Elizabeth?
Is there any discussion of the United States cooperating with Russia on counterterrorism now with the apartment buildings exploding in Moscow? Has there been any talk, any ongoing help with those investigations?
Yes. I mean, preceding the terrible explosions in Moscow of the past several days, we have had an ongoing exchange of information with the Russian government as it pertains to counter-terrorist activities, and have found that very productive. And the Russians, I think, have found it very useful. And it certainly predates the terrible explosions of the past few days.
The ongoing conversations, what kind of help is being given, and is it military help and so on and so forth?
It's an exchange of information. It isn't so much people as it is information. And trying to share information that we feel the Russians would find useful, and hopefully that would serve them in some way to become aware of some sort of terrorist activity that might be about to take place within their nation, that they could take action to stop before it happens. So it's information exchange rather than people or things.
Particularly about the recent explosions of the apartment buildings. Was there any help on that since they've exploded? Has the United States provided any particular specific?
Not so far. The Russian authorities are going through the aftermath of the explosions for clues, for any sort of information as to the type of explosive device used, any sort of indications that what do I have here? Do I have criminal activity? Do I have terrorist activity? And when they get that sorted out, if they wish to approach the United States and ask for some help, we'd be very receptive in that regard, I'm sure. It's a common cause. It's an area that we can agree on almost across the board.
Officials in Moscow, they believe that Osman bin Laden is behind all these terrorist activities in Russia.
I would refer you to the Russians that made those statements.
But they're saying they are now ready to work with Washington.
And on that, I would agree.
Doesn't this have the signature of the tactics used against the United States to put enormous amounts of explosives next to or in buildings? Isn't that the Osama bin Laden fingerprint?
Sadly, it's the fingerprint of a large number of terrorist organizations around the world. It's a pretty efficient way to do damage to large numbers of people and structures, unfortunately. So I don't think he's got sole claim to that.
During his visit to Moscow, Secretary Cohen pledged U.S. assistance in tracking down those responsible for these specific bombings. Was he going beyond what has been a traditional relationship as of late in terms of intelligence sharing? Is he talking about anything else besides exchanging information?
I think if the Russians would come to us in this particular case, and if they would have some sort of exceptional request, I think that's what Secretary Cohen was referring to when he made that statement when he was in Russia. The exchange of information has been ongoing and long-standing. But if there's a particular request that the Russians would find particularly helpful to solve this, I think we'd be very receptive to saying yes if it's at all within our power to do so.
Yeah, the CIA last week released an unclassified estimate on missile threats, and one of the statements in that report was that Pakistan has M11 missiles from China. This statement has been disputed by the State Department in order apparently to avoid sanctions on China. The senior CIA official who briefed reporters referred people to the National Air Intelligence Center study, which says that these missiles are in fact in Pakistan. Does the Pentagon have a view on whether Chinese M11 missiles are in Pakistan?
Well, I think you're talking two issues. On the one hand, the State Department said that it's not enough to go sanctions because intelligence reports by themselves are not enough to impose sanctions or make a sanctions decision, Bill. But I'm not going to get into
Components versus missiles.
Yeah.
And the judgment is that the missiles are there. Is it the Pentagon's view that Pakistan has M11 missiles as opposed to components or related technology?
I'll have to take that question. I'll take that question.
Question.
Dale?
Admiral, Secretary Danzig went to the White House a week or so ago to deliver a briefing, as I understand it, on the situation on Vieques. And yesterday, a group of delegation from Puerto Rico was here and met with Secretary De Leon to discuss Vieques. Is there an attempt underway now to resolve the Vieques situation independent of the Rush panel? What is the Rush panel's status now? Is its report been delivered either in writing or been any kind of informal briefing? Where are we on this?
Yesterday, let me address yesterday's meeting first. That was a specific request by the governor, knowing that the Rush panel report had not yet been delivered, so that it could be very clear. The members of the governor's working group could make very clear their positions to Undersecretary De Leon on that issue before the Rush panel was published, and it moves on up from Mr. Rush to Secretary Cohen and beyond. So the timing of that was very specific, Dale. I spoke to Mr. Rush yesterday morning. He's still working on it. I would expect it out in the near future, but I don't have a precise timeline for you.
Question on Iraq. Yesterday, State Department issued a report on Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and he's getting, according to the report, much more stronger day by day, and food for oil is being sold. Several shipments being caught in Kuwait. So what is the future now as far as U.S. is concerned and their involvement in Iraq?
I'm not sure I understood your question. I'm sorry.
His military, and he's getting much more stronger than in the past.
This was in that report yesterday. Okay. All right.
And oil for food is being misused by him rather than feeding the babies, but spending on his military.
I don't think I can add anything to yesterday's report.
Thank you.
Thank you.